Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. I'm continuing my series about the Menshevik counter-revolution, debunking the claim that the Mensheviks supposedly were much more popular than the Bolsheviks. I didn't really have space in the previous video because it was so long to include this, so I'll just put it here. So here's a little discussion about repression and freedom of speech. According to the Mensheviks and right SRs, the Bolsheviks were persecuting all freedom, and anti-communist hacks claim that the popularity of anti-Bolsheviks would have been evident if it wasn't for Bolshevik tyranny. However, anti-communist philosopher Russell said about his visit to Russia, quote, "We were all allowed complete freedom to see politicians of opposition parties, and we naturally made full use of this freedom. We saw Mensheviks, social revolutionaries of different groups, and anarchists. We saw them without the presence of any Bolsheviks," unquote. Historian E.H. Carr writes, quote, "In May 1920, members of the British Labour delegation visiting Moscow were allowed complete freedom to see politicians of opposition parties and even attended a session of the Menshevik Central Committee," unquote. The capitalist editor of Victor Serge's Year One of the Russian Revolution writes that, quote, "The pitiful showing made by the non-Bolshevik but Sovietist organizations in Soviet elections is probably due not simply to police action," unquote. In other words, he doesn't believe that the unpopularity of anti-Bolshevik parties was merely because of repression. Lansbury, a pacifist social democrat and a friend of anarchist Prince Kropotkin, traveled around Soviet Russia with anarchists Emma Goldman and Alec Berkman as his translators, and also spoke with American anarchist workers at a cooperative they owned. He visited many factories and said, quote, "While going around these factories, we were informed that the day before the election of representatives to the Moscow Soviet had taken place. I inquired if it was true that only communists could be elected and that terrorism was used to prevent the free exercise of the vote. No one I asked had ever seen any terrorism, and everyone assured me that irrespective of opinion, any person qualified to vote might be elected," unquote. H.G. Wells tells his experience of the Petrograd Soviet. First, he saw Zinoviev argue that peace should be signed with Poland, then spoke, quote, "an oldish man who made a bitter attack upon the irreligion of the people and government of Russia. Russia was suffering for her sins, and until she repented and returned to religion, she would continue to suffer one disaster after another." His opinions were not those of the meeting, but he was allowed to have his say without interruption. The decision to make peace with Poland was then taken by a show of hands, unquote. In other words, even anti-Bolsheviks were able to express their opinions freely, although their opinions didn't seem to be very popular. How did the Mensheviks, right SRs and capitalists use their freedom? Until July 1918, when the Yaroslavl uprising took place, quote, "Enemies of the regime enjoyed free speech with a more than parliamentary latitude. With monotonous enthusiasm they celebrate the praises of the Constituent Assembly. The autocracy of the commissars has within 6 months produced the total ruin of Russia, laid waste by German imperialism," cries a right SR who demands the Constituent Assembly, the cancellation of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, and re-entry into the war on the side of the Allies. The lawyer Kogan Bernstein, a right SR, shouts at the Bolsheviks, "Get out before you are chased out. You are only in power thanks to bayonets." He denounces the October counter-revolution and Lenin the insensible. "You are savages, madmen, bandits," screamed another at the end of the session of 14th May at Sverdlov's imperturbable face, unquote. Menshevik writer Denicke says that in the Soviet congresses and meetings, quote, "Menshevik leaders were allowed to speak freely, to criticize the government in the sharpest way. The chairman of the Central Executive Committee, Sverdlov, was an unimpeachably correct parliamentarian. Once, it is true, he made Martov leave the hall on 25th of April, but then Martov had disregarded several calls to order, and Sverdlov did what any chairman of a democratic parliament would have done. For several months, the Mensheviks were able to use the Central Executive Committee as a tribune for their anti-governmental views," unquote. In the Soviet Central Executive Committee, left SR leader, quote, Maria Spiridonova, now attacks the Bolsheviks with a passion bordering on hysteria. She speaks of the murdered and betrayed Ukraine, accuses the Bolshevik usurpers of ruining the peasantry, of sending the Germans secret trains loaded with gold, of being in the service of Germany. Lenin shakes his head as he listens. His rebuttals, which are sometimes drowned in interruptions, are notable for their common sense. A party which drives its sincerest representatives to wallow in this mire of lies and errors is a doomed party." Unquote. The Mensheviks also made similar statements, claiming that the Bolsheviks were German agents. Quote, "On March 12th, the Fourth All-Russian Congress of Soviets opened in Moscow. This Congress was to have final say on war and peace, or rather on the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. As soon as the Congress opened, Menshevik leader Martov made the following statement. This Congress is deciding the question of the first partition of Russia and the sale of the Russian Revolution to German imperialism. Remember, nothing will ever save or allow any of those who will take part in deciding this question here in this hall to escape. Years, decades will pass, but the international people's proletariat will remember you with a curse." Martov made this menacing philippic in connection with the demand for the admission of Menshevik representatives to the Credentials Committee of the Congress. Martov argued that the Congress, which was supposed to decide upon the peace question, assembled in the dark. The Credentials Committee was composed on the basis of proportionality. Levin entered it from the Mensheviks, but he, of course, could not detect any signs of rigging of the Congress." Unquote. This is worth noting because even to this day, anti-communists occasionally claim that various Soviet congresses, and especially the one that decided on the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, were somehow rigged, and that is also what Martov himself claimed, but that turned out not to be the case. The SRs and Mensheviks made violent threats and outrageous slanders and lies in the Soviet Central Executive Committee, but they were not persecuted for it. They also spread all kinds of other lies as much as they could in order to enrage the public. Citing the British government White Book, the Liberator magazine tells the following lies invented by the Mensheviks and SRs. Quote, "On July 19th, a delegation of working women came to the Extraordinary Commission, Cheka. All were dressed in mourning. One of them, weeping hysterically, begged that the body of her husband be given her for burial. The husband of this woman had been arrested a few days before during investigation of alleged counter-revolutionary activities of a strike committee of which he was a member. He was found to be alive and in good health. Asked how she concluded that her husband must be dead, she said that a Menshevik agitator had told her so. The other women made similar statements. Worker delegations came asking the Cheka if there was truth in the rumors about the mass shooting of working men. They had heard it from Mensheviks and right social revolutionary agitators. An example of a bourgeois newspaper banned by the Bolsheviks was the Evening Life of Moscow, which was fined 25,000 rubles for printing an invented degree regarding the socialization of women. The Mensheviks and right SRs were excluded from the Soviet executive committees and their newspapers were suppressed only after they organized the Yaroslavl White Guard uprising and other similar attacks in July 1918. They were not suppressed yet for the Menshevik and SR participation in all the earlier counter-revolutionary plots, but in some cases met with only local restrictions. Could any other government be expected to show as much tolerance as the Bolsheviks? In Georgia, where the Mensheviks were in control, the Mensheviks themselves had already completely outlawed the Bolshevik party months before. And yet, the Mensheviks hypocritically pretended like they were being treated unfairly. After a small section of the Menshevik party, including Martov and Dan, claimed that they did not agree with allying with the White Guards, although we know that they were not being fully truthful, they were still allowed to continue operating legally until eventually they got involved in more counter-revolutionary intrigues. The Left SR party was banned only after they launched an armed coup attempt against the Bolsheviks. Those Left SRs who denounced the coup were allowed to stay in Soviets and operate legally. They changed their name to Narodny Communists or Revolutionary Communists. A section of the right SRs, the centrist faction of Volsky, also denounced allying with the White Guards, and they were allowed to operate without restrictions by the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks, SRs and their capitalist allies never showed the same level of toleration for Bolshevism, murdering them en masse, totally outlawing the Bolsheviks everywhere that they came to power. The daughter of Menshevik parents, Vera Broido, writes that, quote, "Executions of Mensheviks were rare," unquote. But on the other hand, the Mensheviks and their capitalist allies carried out several massacres and mass executions of Bolsheviks. It's actually quite funny that the anti-communists always claim the Bolsheviks came to power in an unpopular plot, but the anti-Bolshevik forces themselves used practically only that method. Quote, "The left and right SRs and the anarchists, not to speak of the monarchists and liberal capitalists, conducted futile putsches or preparations for putsches without the slightest popular backing," unquote. according to the capitalist editor of Victor Serge's Year 1 of the Russian Revolution. And of course, such plots always failed miserably. Menshevik claims about persecution are even less credible because even in emigration they accused each other of being just as bad as the Bolsheviks. According to capitalist historian Ascher, one Menshevik, quote, caustically rebuked Menshevik Dan and his supporters in 1925, saying, "At bottom, this is a continuing heritage of Bolshevik methods. Opposition within the party is something impermissible. It must always remain silent." Unquote. In his book on the Mensheviks, Liebig writes that, quote, Yuri Denicke has spoken of a purge and of a police regime in the Menshevik party, and in 1920 the Central Committee undertook a re-registration of party members, that is, a party purge, never fully carried out, to exclude automatically those party members who disagreed with the controversial new party platform. Pyotr Garvey had ample grounds to complain that, quote, the organizational Bolshevization of the party took place under war communism, unquote. Now let's get to what I consider to be the main topic of this video, so the so-called Workers Assemblies movement, and also the so-called non-partyist movement of 1918 to 1921. The so-called Workers Assemblies were the largest working-class opposition movement in Bolshevik Russia, and the phenomena of non-partyism is basically just part of that. The Workers' Assemblies were basically a rival movement that tried to create something kinda similar to the Soviets, although anti-communist historians sometimes, especially Vladimir Brovkin, claim that the Workers' Assemblies were like this huge movement and that it was definitely Menshevik and that they were definitely anti-Bolshevik and that they really threatened the Bolsheviks. In reality, the Workers' Assemblies were never really a large movement. They never really posed a serious challenge to the Bolsheviks. And in fact, the movement wasn't even consistently anti-Bolshevik. The Mensheviks did try to recruit labor aristocrats, criminals, black hundreds, and the least conscious workers into that movement, and they tried to use that movement. But many people in the movement supported Bolshevism and only criticized certain Bolshevik policies, hoping that they could help the Bolshevik government by pushing for certain changes. Furthermore, the Mensheviks and right SRs always characterized the assembly movement as non-party, precisely because they knew that the workers wouldn't support the Menshevik party. And especially in these discussions, although even somewhat outside of these discussions, the Mensheviks presented themselves simply as better Bolsheviks, claiming that they support the same goals, but only want to do things better, or want to suggest a better way of reaching those goals. But the Mensheviks' real goals were abolishing the Soviets and replacing them with a constituent assembly, so basically a bourgeois parliament. They also wanted to dismantle socialism and set up a capitalist state. They wanted to rejoin the imperialist world war, and the right SRs, the Mensheviks' main ally, even said that the land reform would have to be rolled back and that it would take 20 years to implement any land reform in Russia. So there's absolutely zero chance that the workers would have ever supported such goals. So instead, the Mensheviks and right SRs claim that they actually supported socialism and Soviet power, etc., etc. When the Mensheviks had already lost all support in the Soviets, in the late 1917 to early 1918, they tried to create a competing movement of, quote, assemblies of shop delegates as an organization of non-party workers. The workers boycotted the assembly of shop delegates, and as a result, the assembly, according to its own admission, represented only a small section of the Petrograd workers, unquote. Although this movement was started and organized by the Mensheviks and right SRs, they always portrayed it as independent of all parties, because they knew that the workers would not support Menshevism. Anti-communist historian Rabinovich writes that the Worker Assembly project, which tried to compete with the Soviets, and which the Mensheviks tried unsuccessfully to use for their purposes, was strengthened significantly by, quote, the massive move of Bolsheviks from factory to military and government work, unquote. In other words, because the more conscious workers left, it increased the relative strength of the less conscious workers, but it didn't actually represent any kind of rise in the popularity of anti-Bolshevism. Rabinovich actually says that the Worker Assembly movement consisted of people who were dissatisfied with all parties, and also said that they were dissatisfied with all intellectuals and theories, that is, seemingly the most backward and unorganized people. In their meetings, there were complaints about the spreading anti-Semitism among their supporters. Of course, the Mensheviks tried to utilize such people. Not only did these people use outright Black Hundred anti-Semitic arguments against Bolshevism, they also used slogans such as "Down with Lenin and horseflesh, give us the Tsar and pork," which is a truly idiotic slogan, basically saying that they don't care about anything else, they don't care about politics, they don't care about any kind of liberty or freedom or democratic rights. All they care about is slightly better living standards, which supposedly existed under the Tsar. And even that is of course extremely short-sighted, because if conditions were slightly better under the Tsar, then they must be referring to the time before the war, and it was only a matter of time before the Tsarist state would go into crisis the way it did, and it was also only a matter of time before conditions in Soviet Russia itself would improve once the war ended. According to anti-communist historian Feiges, the Worker Assemblies did not support Menshevism or the right SRs, though the Mensheviks and right SRs participated in them as actively as possible. Most meetings of the assemblies expressed that they agreed with the Bolshevik goals, but were upset that they had not been fulfilled. Quote, "The thing that exercised the workers most was a general feeling that the promise of a workers' revolution, promise that had led many of them to support the Bolsheviks in the autumn of 1917, had not been fulfilled. As the striking workers of the Sormovo factory declared in June, the Soviet regime promised to bring the workers socialism, but has brought them empty factories and destitution," unquote. These workers simply did not understand that the goal wouldn't be achieved so quickly. Carrying out the revolution and socialist construction turned out to be much more difficult and protracted, but it was still eventually done. Thus, even the complaints of these workers were fully satisfied by the Bolsheviks eventually. Feiges also claims that the Mensheviks won Soviet elections in some places, but he provides no sources for this claim. He writes that Brovkin claims workers who made complaints about the Bolshevik government consciously supported Menshevism, but according to Feiges, the opposite view, that those workers didn't support any party, is, quote, "more persuasive," unquote. And this is generally the view shared by almost all historians, that these anti-Bolshevik opposition movements among workers generally did not support any competing party, but only had some criticism towards the Bolsheviks. Brovkin himself quotes one Menshevik who describes the sentiment of these workers as, quote, "a curse on you all, Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, with all your politics," unquote, which only demonstrates that many of these workers were simply fed up with politics altogether and were not very politically conscious. According to bourgeois historian Pavlyuchenko, the non-partyist workers often said, quote, "we don't care who has the political power, just give us bread," unquote. And William G. Rosenberg writes that, quote, "the largest number of worker assembly delegates came from plants formerly engaged in defense production, including 7 that had been entirely closed down. The only other significant representation came from 16 typesetting and print shops, strongholds of Menshevism," unquote. He puts the word delegates into quotation marks. That may be because he thinks the delegates are not representative. There's other sources that say the delegates were not elected, but I'm not entirely sure why he does that. At any rate, it seems clear that, based on what he says, these workers basically consisted of 2 different kinds. There were the more privileged, more petty bourgeois and less class-conscious workers from print shops. They were by far the Mensheviks' strongest constituency among the workers. And there were also industrial workers, but they were from the armaments industry, and they clearly got involved in this movement purely as an accident or an exception, because they just happened to work in an industry that was basically closed down, or at least heavily scaled down, when the country's involvement in the World War ceased. So there was a lot of unemployment in their field, so they got involved in this opposition movement. He continues, quote, "Those most active in the movement seem to have been predominantly semi-skilled metal workers who, despite their strong protest in the spring of 1918, had long had close ties to the Bolsheviks. Probably their political loyalties still lay in that direction. Their dissidence seems to have been directed more toward obtaining effective relief than in support of the Mensheviks or other opposition parties, and votes of protest are never the same as a commitment to the opposition," unquote. So, in his opinion, although the more petty bourgeois print workers maybe supported Menshevism, the metal workers from the armaments industry were supporters of Bolshevism, but they still made strong criticisms of the government because they wanted economic relief. Rosenberg also states that even those workers who protested still understood that stricter methods of discipline were necessary in the current conditions and that the economic hardship was to an extent unavoidable, and thus they still put their hopes in the Bolshevik state and believed that it will solve these issues and that their protest and criticism would only hasten it and help the Bolsheviks solve these problems. Brovkin writes, quote, Bolshevik newspapers throughout the country covered the assembly proceedings fairly accurately. Here, for example, is the report on the session of June 1st published by the Saratov Izvestia, which says, the parties of the social traders have decided to use the food supply crisis for their own ends. By demagogical agitation, the Mensheviks and SRs have managed to arouse backward elements of the Petrograd proletariat and to create a provocateur organization parallel to the Soviet, the so-called Assembly of Uполномоченные of Factories and Plants, which was not, in fact, elected by anyone. Here, open propaganda is going on for a political strike directed at the overthrow of Soviet power. At the meeting on June 1st, the right SR were for an immediate strike and the Mensheviks against it because it was clear that an immediate strike would not be successful, unquote. Indeed, eventually the worker assemblies tried to organize a one-day protest strike, which obviously wouldn't have been very significant or able to overthrow the Bolsheviks, but even that failed, and the whole movement dissipated. Brovkin writes that, quote, according to official Bolshevik sources, the Yellow Strike on July 2nd failed, only a bunch of counter-revolutionaries participated. The non-Bolshevik papers also spoke of the strike's failure, unquote. This is pretty significant because, at least according to Brovkin, the Workers' Assembly movement was the most significant anti-Bolshevik movement among the proletariat itself, and the movement seemed to be not nearly as significant or powerful as Brovkin claims. It also seemed to consist of many workers who didn't even disagree with Bolshevik goals, but were only temporarily critical of the Bolshevik policies, and it also consisted of some workers who were politically backward. The Mensheviks and SRs tried to utilize both of these by relying on the backwardness of some workers or by pretending to be simply better Bolsheviks. Menshevik Yastrebov said that the Menshevik-SR bloc and the so-called Workers' Assemblies, quote, did not represent anything serious in the sense of a broad mass movement, unquote. The Mensheviks who tried to organize the so-called assembly movement received money from the PBO, the Petrograd Monarchist Combat Organization, the main secret organization of the capitalist class at the time. Menshevik leader Dan also mentions the offers of money coming from the White Guard circles in his book, although he denies accepting the money. Quote, in Petrograd, the remnants of the SRs, Mensheviks and various anarchists banded together and collaborated with the newly formed monarchist Petrograd Combat Organization, as the monarchist organization itself asserted. The monarchist capitalists even printed the Mensheviks leaflets. On March 14, 1921, they issued a leaflet in solidarity with the Kronstadt uprising, which said not a word about socialism or Soviets, but instead called for an uprising against the bloody communist regime in the name of all power to the people, unquote. Menshevik proclamations were printed by the PBO, and these Mensheviks also sent their greetings to the main emigre Menshevik newspaper, Socialistische Vestnik, thus demonstrating that they were supporting so-called official Menshevism and were not any kind of exceptional ultra-rightist group. Quote, here is a remarkable message we find in Dan's book, 2 Years of Searching, published in Berlin. Dan writes, our organization received an invitation to send its representative to the meeting of authorized representatives of the Petrograd factories and plants. They decided to send one comrade to get acquainted. It turned out that the so-called meeting was a pure bluff. There were no authorized representatives, but there were individuals who called themselves Plehanovites, left socialist revolutionaries, anarchists, etc., who were definitely not elected by anyone, unquote. So he's talking about the so-called Worker Assembly representatives. Capitalist historian Smith also writes that, quote, little is known of the conduct of these Worker Assembly elections, unquote. But, as Dan and even Brovkin's sources state, they seem to not have been elected by anyone. Although various capitalist historians have listed different reasons why some workers temporarily joined this assembly movement, Smith says that in 1918 the workers in the assembly movement largely complained about the evacuation due to the German threat, and some said that the evacuation was carried out too chaotically, while others said that it was carried out too strictly. Many were scared and wanted to be evacuated sooner. This was the main complaint that Smith noted. In 1921, the non-party workers' movement demanded the equalization of rations. Essentially, they wanted NEP policies, but at the same time they also attacked bourgeois specialists, which would be an anti-NEP position. But they were clearly not really anti-communist or anti-Bolshevik. Capitalist historian Pirani writes, quote, "The egalitarian workerists or non-partyists were the Bolsheviks' natural constituency and had supported them in the October Revolution and the Civil War. At least one of them, Mosolov, from the Justinsky works, was close enough to Bolshevism to regard cleansing its ranks of bourgeois elements as a central task. He said, 'It is communist ideas that we are for. We will throw the rubbish out of the party.' The affinity between some aspects of Bolshevism and the non-party egalitarians was also evident in a session on the trade union question then being debated within the party." Unquote. So this again clearly demonstrates that the movement certainly was not Menshevik, and it wasn't really even anti-Bolshevik, at least not predominantly or exclusively. However, apparently in Moscow, which was a high point of the opposition movement in 1921, there was a strike, quote, "by relatively privileged workers protesting at their loss of privileges," unquote. Their privilege ration had been equalized, just like the non-partyists had demanded. So this again seems to demonstrate the contradiction within the movement itself, because if it consists of people who support Bolshevism and they want maybe more egalitarian policies, and then it consists also of people who support Menshevism, who have privileges and want to keep them, then there's a contradiction. Some of them are upset when privileges are removed, while others demand privileges to be removed. Quote, "Historians relying on the memoirs of SR, SS Maslov, wrote that a special security detachment intervened to stop the strike, killing and wounding several people, but archives now available throw doubt on this." According to Pirani, the cause of the strikes nearly everywhere was the same: bad economic conditions. He notes only very few instances of political statements, especially among non-Bolsheviks, and even the few Menshevik resolutions that were passed, such as by the chemical workers, actually demanded the collaboration of all socialists for better economic conditions, instead of calling for a fight against Bolshevism. He writes, quote, "Moscow workers were extremely angry about the surplus crisis, but were divided as to its causes," unquote. Quote, "The evidence available suggests that, politically, those who voted for non-partyist candidates were first and foremost striving towards some sort of Soviet rule," unquote. Which means that they couldn't have supported Menshevik policies because the Mensheviks said that the Soviets should be replaced with the pre-revolutionary Zemstvos and Dumas. Non-partyist workers, quote, "do not trust the Mensheviks and the SRs, but instead of communists they voted for non-party people on a trial basis," unquote. Quote, "Socialistische Vestnik, the Menshevik newspaper published in Berlin, argues that the threat of repression dissuaded workers from voting for Menshevik and SR candidates or resolutions, and that non-partyism was essentially used as a cover, but there is significant evidence to the contrary," unquote. Pirani says. He writes further, quote, "A leading non-partyist who joined the Bolsheviks in 1924 said in 1920 to 21 he had been a non-partyist on principle. Contemporaneous records show that his speeches to the February Moscow Metal Workers meeting exuded egalitarian workerism. There he said that the Russian economic crisis was due to the failure of Western European workers to follow the Bolsheviks' revolutionary path, and he expressed support for the fight inside the Bolshevik party against bourgeois elements, and implicitly accused the Moscow party leader Kamenev of petty corruption," unquote. Quote, "The workers' protests over supply in Moscow in February 1921 were not united or directed toward overthrowing the Bolsheviks," unquote.